Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I am your host, VIKAS SWARUP. In this week's episode, we will examine the very significant visit of Japanese Prime Minister, His Excellency Fumio Kishida to India on March 2021, during which he held bilateral discussions with Prime Minister Modi and outlined Japan's new vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Relations with Japan have always occupied a very special place for India. Japan is one of the very few countries with which India has a system of annual summits. In 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made his first bilateral visit outside India's immediate neighborhood to Japan. It was during that visit that the India-Japan relationship was upgraded to a special strategic and global partnership. Guided by strong political will on both sides, the partnership has made significant progress in the last few years, marked by growing convergence of political, strategic and economic interests. The visit of Prime Minister Kishida was especially significant because India is the current president of G20 and Japan is the current chair of the G7. In this context, Prime Minister Modi conveyed at length India's priorities for G20, and he heard in turn Prime Minister Kishida's priorities and Japan's priorities for G7. The two leaders also reviewed the progress in bilateral cooperation in areas such as defense equipment and technology collaboration, trade, health and digital partnership, climate and energy, including energy transition, skill development, innovation and people-to-people exchanges. They also had a fruitful discussion on the importance of reliable supply chains in semiconductor and other critical technologies. They expressed satisfaction at the steady progress of the Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed rail project, the India-Japan Industrial Competitiveness Partnership, and efforts towards realizing the target of Japanese investment of 5 trillion yen in India in the next 5 years. The two leaders also discussed regional issues of significance, including the Indo-Pacific. In terms of concrete outcomes of the visit, the two sides renewed the Memorandum of Cooperation in the field of Japanese language education in India and had an exchange of notes for the fourth tranche installment of JICA ODA loan of Japanese yen 300 billion or rupees 18,000 crores for the Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed railway project. The two sides also announced 2023 as India-Japan Year of Tourism with the theme Connecting Himalayas with Mount Fuji. Prime Minister Kishida also gave a major policy speech at New Delhi's Sapru House, at which he outlined Japan's new plan for a free and open Indo-Pacific that respected the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in the region, respected diversity and openness, and was committed to settle disputes through negotiations. He also announced Japan's intention to increase connectivity among countries and promote freedom of navigation with an eye on ramping up maritime defense and security among the like-minded countries of the Indo-Pacific. To this end, Japan plans to mobilize a total of $75 billion in public and private funds by 2030. Now, to unpack the many dimensions of this visit, I will call upon two distinguished experts. Ambassador DEEPA GOPALAN WADHWA is a former diplomat who served as India's ambassador to Japan, Qatar, Sweden, Latvia, and the Republic of Marshall Islands. Dr. SRABANI Roy Choudhury is professor in Japanese Studies in the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, with a specialization in Japan-India economic relations and Japanese economy and management. A very warm welcome to both of you. Let me begin with you, Ambassador WADHWA. Now, it is interesting that Prime Minister Kishida's visit was not styled as the 15th annual summit, but rather as an official visit. Why did Prime Minister Kishida choose to travel to India at this particular time? And what was the political message of his visit?
Very right, Vikas. It was in a way a summit because two heads of government were meeting. but it wasn't a summit in terms of the annual summit processes which we have since 2006 every year, where the prime ministers visit each other's capitals or each other's countries, and there's a format, there's a formal format to this. So I think this particular visit didn't follow that format. Last year we had the 14th summit, annual summit, but nevertheless it was a very significant visit. And the reason was that, the reasons that he chose to come to India were many. One is that every opportunity that there is for both countries to review progress in this strategic and global partnership, I think both prime ministers make sure that, that they don't miss and that there's an opportunity to talk about that. And as you see, this is what happened. So while there was no joint statement or business leaders, forum as they have, but on the other hand, there were agreements signed, and you mentioned them yourself, including this very large tranche, the fourth tranche for the Mumbai Ahmedabad high-speed rail, and which also shows that there's been very good progress on it. 18,000 crores is a lot. So I think they were looking at reviewing the progress in relations. So that was one of the reasons. The second reason I think he came, which you also mentioned, is because of our respective presidencies or chairmanships of G7 and G20. And so I think both of them wanted to talk about their respective priorities, their respective agendas, where they stand on issues, and I understand that there was an exchange on that also. And the third reason was very interesting, was that he chose New Delhi to launch his vision of the Indo-Pacific, the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which, as you know, was really launched, of course, in 2017 formally, but the idea of the Indo-Pacific was born in New Delhi. So I think these were all the reasons that he came, and I mustn't forget a very important reason. I think this was an opportunity for him to come and invite Prime Minister Modi formally to the G7 summit at Hiroshima. That's right.
Dr. Roy Choudhury, how do you assess the present state of economic cooperation between India and Japan? And will this visit further trade and investment opportunities between the two countries?
If you look at the trade and investment standalone, we have an excellent data, 20.57 as far as trade relation goes, and 39.79 billion US dollars as investment goes from 2000 to 2020-22. However, as soon as we get into comparing this with countries, Japan ranks 13th in the trade as a trade partner and 5th as an investment partner to India. And for Japan's outward investment, we are nowhere within the 10 countries that they invest. So there is a lot of scope to improve, and I think over the last year, when we were going through the 70 years of India-Japan relations, much of it has been questioned and looked into. JEBIC survey has been very consistently putting us as second to China in the midterm, and in the long term we are #1. So we do think that opportunities would turn up and things would move towards much more stronger engagement in the economic pillar. The only place where I think we have a great source of encouragement is the ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance, where we are the #1. We have JICA, which is their dispersing agent, working consistently, and they have about 77 projects across our country, and the map of India literally is encircled by JICA projects. Of course, the biggest project that has been mentioned during this visit has been the Mumbai Ahmedabad corridor, and lots of, again, money has come into projects which are going to be JICA driven. However, I think the private investors are where the major catch is, and I think we need to, as two partners, need to work towards finding more trust among the private investors to come into India and engage in activities that would actually promote our development in a more equitable fashion.
Ambassador WADHWA, what about prospects for defense and security cooperation? And how do you see it playing out, particularly in the context of both countries being partners in the Quad?
Well, defense and security cooperation has emerged as a very major pillar in our bilateral relationship. And this is very interesting because it started in about 2008, and the progress has been pretty fast, and there's been a regular deepening of this relationship. And what does this mean, really? That we've had several agreements which have signed between the two countries, including on defense equipment, cooperation in both development and procurement. In addition, we've just had the AXA, which was signed on the side of agreements, which kind of provide the framework for the relationship that has gone on apace. Plus, more interestingly, all our three services, across the three services, we have substantive joint exercises now. So the most recent was the Air Force exercise, is the most substantive that we've had, a full-scale one, which is called Veer Guardian. But we've also have the Coast Guards, of course, have been working together for a much longer time. We have the Malabar exercises. So on the defense side, I think, there has been a great deepening of relationship. But there's one interesting thing, because I talk about this procurement of defense equipment, and there perhaps is where we feel not much is being done despite these agreements. And therefore you find our Prime Minister talk about the whole thing of co-manufacturing. He says that we have to co-innovate, co-design, co-create. And what is the meaning of this? The meaning of this is that we work together, we design it, we do research, we design, we manufacture not only for ourselves, but we also manufacture to be able to export to the world. And this is of particular significance when you look at their own new national security strategy, which I think will give more space for these sort of things to happen. Now, to the part of your question on the Quad. In the Quad, very clearly, I think all partners have taken pains to say this is not a security arrangement. Having said that, and this is reiterated, having said that, what we do see is that today the Malabar exercise, from being US-India, Japan, now is actually a Quad exercise. You see that
Australia is hosting it, in fact.
Exactly. Then all of us mutually have agreements, logistics agreements among us. And the AXA, as I mentioned, just with Japan. So all of them have either an alliance agreement or they have mutual agreements like the RAA that has been signed between Australia and Japan. So that is there. And interestingly, of the working groups in the Quad, there were 4 or 5 working groups set up to kind of institutionalize the Quad, as it were. One of them is on emerging technologies. And here, I think it is really important because there will be a lot of technologies that we are looking at which will have a bearing on defense and security. So it's a yes and no as far as Quad cooperation is concerned.
Dr. Roy Choudhury, now the two Prime Ministers discussed India-Japan cooperation in areas of digital economy and supply chain resilience. Now these two areas also figure in the Quad agenda. Why are they of such critical importance, and how are the two countries working together in these two fields?
Pandemic actually brought out another non-traditional sector, that is the supply chain vulnerability, and India faced it essentially with pharmaceutical because we had large number of raw materials coming from China. Subsequently to this, Quad was the first which came up with the supply chain resilience vertical, and Japan, Australia and India were supposed to get into an alliance of supply chain in which vaccine was the first area where they've worked closely. As far as supply chain, if you look at it, since it has a lot of content in the trade front, bilaterally it doesn't have much meat other than with respect to components in automobile and electronic sector. But what is critically becoming important for India to engage in the supply chain in which either Southeast Asian countries are involved or Australia is involved. And I think this is where India can become a hub. And what we had imagined during the CEPA, we could probably have this as an alternative option to China, and we could gain from it. But statistics from 2020 to now does not give us much reason to feel very excited about the supply chain resilience movement that began, because we haven't got much of an companies looking at India. They've rather gone to Vietnam and Indonesia. As far as digital economy go, the strongest reason for why India feels very excited about it is that we have digitalized in many aspects much better than rest of the world, and we feel that we are in a position to now help other countries digitalize. We have an example of Singapore these days, much talked about in the newspapers about their digital payment system that they've borrowed. But there are also other reasons why digital economy in which India can perform need not be of the quality that the cybersecurity issues that one needs to tackle when you go digital. So there would be a collaboration that is expected between Japan and India, and to bring in a technological changes across the Southeast Asian countries, and generally looking at a more safer Indo-Pacific with respect to cybersecurity. And this is something that was pointed out during Kishida's visit to India this time.
Ambassador WADHWA, now turning now to the Prime Minister's major address at the ICWA, at which I believe you were also present. Why did he choose Delhi as the venue for the articulation of his new Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, he started off at the Sapru House talk by recalling his predecessor, Prime Minister Abe. And the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific, as you know, and we all know now, as part of history, was born in New Delhi when he talked about the confluence of the two seas to the two houses of parliament. And from there then grew this whole concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think for one of the reasons was that. But if you recall, last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June in Singapore, he had said that he would announce it in the spring. There is something about, of course, the global environment has changed, which he talks about. Leaders have changed. Probably Prime Minister Kishida wants to that the FOIP should have his own imprint. I'm quite sure that's also one of the reasons. But I think when he was talking of the FOIP, he was talking about new challenges that have been there, and the challenges that have been both traditional challenges that have been there. There's a reiteration of the original principles, but there are new areas, and one of the areas that I thought was particularly significant was really this outreach to the global south, because he talked about the fact that this region has diverse countries with diverse histories, and that it was important to be flexible, that it was important to be practical, to be able to work together, and to look at development. So these are areas which I think the developing world wants to hear of. So I suppose that was another one of the reasons why he chose Delhi to talk about it. But in whatever it was, he said, and he said this repeatedly, that India is an indispensable part of Japan's FOIP vision. And I suppose that was kind of very important and significant, and the reason why he came here to talk about it.
Dr. Roy Choudhury, take us through the 4 pillars of this new strategy and the new core elements that have been outlined.
As it was said by DEEPA WADHWA ma'am, that it is all about trying to ensure that the entire region of Indo-Pacific accepts Japan as one of the key players in the region. Use of our FOIP is something new. It wasn't there in the previous statements that came about. If you see the 4 verticals, essentially it was reiteration of what was already rule-based, value-oriented, following or allowing sovereignty and taking care of economic order that allows for free and open trade. But under, say, principles of peace and prosperity rule, 2 things that I feel critically again came in, and probably he only wants to reiterate it, is that in the economic order allowing for multilateralism to work, he brings in CPTPP, saying that such kind of initiatives would continue to actually engage and create a more free and open Indo-Pacific. He also does bring into the element of peace, and he talks about the peace with respect to also looking into the perspective of women, which I thought was pretty interesting, and probably trying to actually, sort of reach out to the common man, because that he brings in the term called people gets, at least 8 mentions across the common man and people. With respect to addressing challenges in the Indo-Pacific way, he actually turns to looking at the global commons, which is against an agenda that is very strongly embedded in the G20. So climate, security, cybersecurity, environment, energy transitions, and each has mentioned in each paragraph But however, I felt these challenges were being addressed in the previous FOIP also, document also. Coming to the next, multi-layered connectivity, I think the multi-layered is basically what he means about physical connectivity and digital connectivity, which is obviously becoming a premium cause. And in connectivity, he brings across country-wise, and he talks about 100 million US dollars being invested in ASEAN. And he talks about quality infrastructure. These were all something that already existed. But he does bring in the Bay of Bengal initiative of Bangladesh and, initiating it through Bangladesh, and also talks about Sri Lanka, but Pacific Islands, and ultimately one-liner where he used Middle East, Latin America, and also other, he claims it as other countries. So this is where the whole, I think, idea of moving his own economic agenda seems to be placed into some kind of action. The last vertical, which he talks about efforts in securitizing the safe use of air and sea, is essentially what was why I think the initial Indo-Pacific concept grew on this fact of securitizing this. And he talks in detail about, gives in certain details about maritime thing, rule of law, having clarity about each country's boundaries, international law, where element of what China, aggressive China is doing, which instead of mentioning it as China, but he sort of brings it out in open. And of course, as ma'am already said, in the defense cooperation, he brings in RAA and ASCA as ways and means of trying to create a collective security issue. So I think the verticals are pretty close to what the former document of FOIP was, but probably this has a little more of action in it than was described more as a concept before. Now you have a more action-oriented document in front of you.
Ambassador WADHWA, now the Indo-Pacific plan should be seen in the context of the Kishida government's efforts to reinforce Japan's defense capabilities within 5 years by substantially increasing military spending, both to defend the country and to contribute to peace and stability in the region. What have been the primary drivers for this dramatic shift in Japan's pacifist approach?
You would remember, Vikas, even from the time you and I were together there in Japan, there was always a debate on about, how much should go into the defense budget, how should they get out of this, self-imposed restraints that were there, which followed the Second World War. That certainly was there from that time. So I think what have been the changes? Before I go to what the changes, I must say that despite all these restraints, what we do find is that when they were budgeting for about 1% of GDP and the Japanese GDP was growing, already there was actually a net accretion in terms of the size of their military, and therefore they were probably the 9th largest in the world. So that is where we start from. But then you find a deterioration in their security environment without a doubt. So if you look at each element of that, you look at China, what has happened with China is, of course, their activism, if one may say, without caring for rule of law, both in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. East China Sea, they have a direct dispute with them over the Senkakus. Now you have a new added threat of Taiwan, use of force to take over Taiwan, which is something that I think which has alarmed Japan hugely. So you have the problems with China. You also have now the North Koreans. They always were there, but if you see that in terms of missile and nuclear technologies, there's in fact they have been unabashed about using it and using it as a threat. So that has been the second element. The third element really has been Russia, because if the years that we recall, there was actually a form of, there was an effort for a rapprochement between the two. I remember that Prime Minister Abe and Putin met some 27 times, but obviously that didn't reach anywhere. And now you find a huge change in that relationship. That's what I see. And I think following from the February last 22 agreement between Russia and China, strengthening the pact between the two of them, this was followed by joint exercises, both air and maritime, in areas very too close for comfort to Japan. So I think this has been really what has happened insofar as their security environment is concerned. There's another very important thing is that, they have grown very close to NATO and the Western Alliance. And over there, if you find they went for the first time and attended the NATO summit, you have Japan there. So what you find really is that most of those countries have actually a limit of 2% of GDP as far as their military budgets are concerned. So they are now conforming more to that. Also, probably the Americans have been pushing them to, take more of a responsibility insofar as their defense is concerned. So they're doing that also. So this is another reason I think that you find that they, certainly that you find that the defense budget. And I must mention the third and the most important thing is the people. And we talked about the people. In a democracy, they're very important. And for the first time, it seems the Japanese have not objected. They seem to have some appetite for an increase in military expenditure and the strengthening of defense capabilities, and particularly counterattack. And this comes from two things. One is what has happened in Ukraine, which I think seems to have affected them hugely, and the fact that could this be a model for what could happen to Taiwan, which is too close to them. So I think this is really the reasons.
Dr. Roy Choudhury, now Japan has been working to integrate Northeast India with the rest of Southeast Asia. So far, this has manifested itself in investment via Japanese overseas development assistance, in infrastructure development to enable connectivity. How does this dovetail under the bigger plan for a free and open Indo-Pacific?
If you look at Northeast region independently of the mainland India, you see that the connectivity of Northeast is much more faster and quicker through the Bay of Bengal Sea. To reach the Bay of Bengal Sea, the initial plan was, of course, to use the Myanmar as a thing, move on to Thailand, and thereof take off through those ports. Unfortunately, with the crisis that they face politically with Myanmar, the issue is they're looking at a different alternative. And the alternative has emerged as Bangladesh for two reasons. One is that Bangladesh is a growing economy, seems to be scaling up, would move into the developing economy mode. And the second part is that Bangladesh has a certain amount of political stability. And I think the third cause is also because China has been also very keenly investing in Bangladesh, and therefore Japan wants to have a larger say and a bigger footprint out there, and they're involved in lots of plans with JICA, that is again Japan International Cooperation Agency, who's aiding a lot of things, including ports and infrastructure in Bangladesh. Given the situation and Matabari becoming the 1.1 million TEU center, and by 2026 they want to operate it with having at least 70% increase in cargo shipment facilities. The one way that Northeast can sort of integrate into the Indo-Pacific is using that particular port. What they have is a very ambitious plan, and Government of India would have to also see whether that plan is applicable to an Indian counter, as for us as a whether it really has an interest of ensuring we have environmentally taking care of that region, because it's basically a very pristine region next to the heartland India. So effectively taking into all account what they have in plan is something that is between Thailand and Cambodia. So from Tripura, Meghalaya, connecting up to Bangladesh port, Matabari port, and then using it as an exit. The plan is ambitious, the motives are there, but I think for us as an Indian counterpart, we'll have to weigh many options before we can really jump into such an initiative.
Ambassador WADHWA, now 2023 is a pivotal year for both India and Japan as chairs of two major international groupings. India as the president of the G20, Japan as the chair of the G7. How important is it for the two groupings to work together in shaping the global agenda?
Yes, very valid. And I think, as I said to begin with, this was one of the reasons for the visit, I think. Of course, G7 is part of the G20, so to speak. But I think as the chairs of these two groupings, we have our respective agendas, we have our respective priorities, more importantly. And this visit gave an opportunity, I think, for us to hear each other out on our priorities, and also an elaboration of where we would like these processes to go. So I think to that extent been very, very important. So what are we really looking at? I mean, as far as India is concerned, India has historically been a part of really a country that gave voice to the global south. And, we have wanted to bring development back onto the global agenda. Because, of course, there's a great churn in geopolitics, no doubt about it, not only in Europe, but in different parts of the world. But on the other hand, the existing problems of development have got exacerbated now. You have climate change, environmental degradation, a huge lot of other issues, and we shouldn't take our eye off the ball, because these are important issues. And I think we have very rightfully taken the lead Because after all, G20 was formed in a way to go beyond the G7, which were the rich industrialized countries, and bring the concerns of the others on board. So as far as this is concerned, we would certainly be voicing it. And I find that the Japanese also, and I talked to you about the what Prime Minister Kishida had to say about how they would work with the rest of the countries. And particularly, I mean, he did mention the Global South, but the Global South. So I think what will happen is that these are areas where we can have convergences. Where will the convergences be? In some of the areas that I think SRABANI just mentioned. You talk about climate change, talk about energy transition, talk about environmental protection, global health.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador WADHWA and Professor Roy Choudhury, for your insights. Prime Minister Modi and Kishida met 3 times in 2022, including at the funeral of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. They will meet at least 3 times more in 2023 on the sidelines of the G20, G7 and Quad summits. This is good, not only for India and Japan, but for the entire Indo-Pacific region. As Prime Minister Kishida has said, peace and unwavering trust and the close coordination between India and Japan as leading democracies of Asia are the cornerstones of peace and prosperity in the region. That is all I have for you in this diplomatic dispatch. I will be back next week with another dispatch from the front lines of international geopolitics. Till then, take care and goodbye.